Hello, hello, and welcome to this Business Day Dialogues in association with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and the Ecumenical Foundation of Southern Africa. And today we are going to unpack a very important topic. We're looking at ethical leadership in a conflict. And we're going to focus particularly on an ongoing conflict that is affecting the entire globe, the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But before we get into the nitty-gritties of our discussion this morning, I'd like to welcome Chris Endres from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, who is just going to welcome all of us and just invite us all into this conversation. Welcome, Chris, and thank you for coming and being with us.
Good morning, Nompumelelo and dear panel. Thank you, dear audience, for joining us. My name is Chris Endres, and I today represent EFSA and CAS, the hosts of this series of 3 online discussions. CAS, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, is a German political foundation closely associated with the Christian Democratic Union, the main opposition party of Germany. The CDU is the party of the Chancellors Konrad Adenauer, Helmut Kohl, and Angela Merkel. We operate in over 120 countries, promoting multi-party democracy, the rule of law, and the social market economy as a societal basis for achieving the human dignity of the individual. Via public education projects like this one, we work with local partners to provide a space for each society to explore its own democratic journey. To learn more about our work and events like this one, please subscribe to our Twitter and Facebook profiles and visit our website at www.kas.de/South Africa. Our local partner today is EFSA. EFSA is the Ecumenical Foundation of South Africa and promotes dialogue and consensus between different sectors and role players on the challenges facing our diverse society. These sectors can be religious, academic, political, business, media, and community organizations. The Institute strives to play a facilitating role by providing a platform for public debate of issues, even controversial ones, thus focusing public attention on specific problems in society. Like last year, this series of 3 online dialogues with the Business Day on ethical leadership will uncover values and strategies to address South African challenges within a changing global environment. Here, there are no easy answers. Leaders from business, politics, academia, and the faith community aim to nourish each other's understanding of the biggest challenges by exploring each other's viewpoints. This year, the Business Day dialogues with EFSA and CAS speak to the 3 themes of conflict, hunger, and the just energy transition. The link between them is evident when opening the newspaper any day of the week. We begin with the theme conflict today, which has accelerated the challenges of hunger and energy. I look forward to today's discussion and you joining us for the upcoming 2 events. Thank you for your attention, and I hand the floor back to you, Nompumelelo.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that warm welcome and introduction. Yes, this is actually quite an apt discussion, a very important one that really affects the entire world population. And we are talking about ethical leadership in a conflict. And the question that we are trying to answer today is, what is the role of ethical leadership in the face of ongoing conflict? And we know that the impacts of the Russia-Ukraine conflict are being felt. The ripple effects are running across, and even here in our own country, in South Africa, we are feeling the impacts. We have the sanctions on consumers and business. We've got, disputes and confusion and disagreements within the faith community regarding where to stand on this war. We also have the question of South Africa's own position on the conflict. Does it really reflect our values as a nation? And so we want to use this opportunity having this multi-stakeholder conversation with the faith community, with the business community, with civil society representatives to unpack this question, the role of ethical leadership in a conflict. And this is, as Chris has said, not an easy conversation at all. There are no easy answers. And joining us today to help us in this conversation, we've got Reverend Jerry Pillay, who is the Dean at the Faculty of Theology and Religion and the General Secretary-elect of the World Council of Churches. He's the Dean at the University of Pretoria. And then we've got Ray Hartley, who is Research Director at the Brenthurst Foundation. We've also got Stephen Gruzd, who is the head of African governance and of the African Governance and Diplomacy program at the South African Institute of International Affairs, SAIIA for short. So I'd like to welcome all our speakers who are going to set the scene by providing their own perspective on this question. I'm going to put Reverend Pillay on the hot seat first. But before you come on, Reverend Pillay, I just want to remind the audience that there is a chat function where you can input your comments and questions. We will try to get to them towards the end of the discussion. Please do put your questions there and interact with us and engage with us, because this is a conversation for all of us. Reverend Pillay, please, Jerry, can you come on and just paint the picture from the faith community's perspective for us?
Thank you very much. I think the important thing with regards to ethical leadership is that we live in a world where there are numerous contradictions and inconsistencies. And very often we do not understand what it means to speak about ethical leadership in a way that it should be. We see that in the context of South Africa. We see that in the context of the Ukraine-Russia situation, but we see that in life in general. And I think ethical leadership is about getting to the truth. That is the first thing. And getting to the truth involves deep political, social, economic analysis to understand what is the given reality, the given context, and how do we actually speak into this context truthfully. And I think ethical leadership requires and demands of us to understand the dynamics of the changes in terms of the context. Very often we do not do these kind of analyses. We take positions that favors us. We take positions that actually speaks well for us from economic gain, from political aspirations, and very often we do not stand consistently for truth. And I think that's precisely what we're experiencing in our country, in the world today. Therefore, ethical leadership comes into question. So conflict situations are always going to be with us, but consistency of character and conduct must speak for itself. And therein comes what I will call self-ethical analyses. So we need to speak for ourselves and ask, how can I be consistent at home, in the workplace, wherever I am, in terms of what I'm saying and what I'm doing? Now, in the context of what we're experiencing at the moment, people say one thing about something, and then the very next time they say something different about something else, and yet the situation demands justice. So we do not talk about justice in the context of how we should understand justice. Justice becomes reflective in terms of what works for me and what doesn't work for me. So we stand in line with justice when it works, but we are not prone to stand for justice when it doesn't work in our favor. And that, for me, is a critical question of the South African government. Its inconsistencies. It has taken the role of being neutral in many issues and with the Ukraine-Russian situation. But the question is it neutral? Why don't you speak consistently about the ravages of war? And why don't you condemn war in the first place? Because war is unacceptable. But yet in the South African context, we have remained silent about that for a long time until we were pressurized to say something about the war situation. So the question is why? Why will we talk about justice in one place and not talk about justice in another place? So for me, ethical leadership is important, and this is where religious communities come in. Religious communities have to talk about being a watchdog and to exercise a prophetic call and ministry to our leaders to ask the question, Are we consistent about what we're saying? Are we consistent about what we do? Does character and conduct work on par in terms of how we relate to situations and context and dynamics? So ethical leadership is an important thing that is in question at the moment. Unfortunately, it has become inconsistent and variable depending on the gains that one makes in terms of a situation and a decision that one comes to. And therefore, it needs to be interrogated. And from a religious point of view, we of course do that, seeking to understand how does one exemplify the life of Jesus Christ, for example, in terms of giving of himself, the kenosis, self-emptying of himself, and putting others first, and standing for the support and the justness of the other. And that's what I think we need to do in terms of how we face situations today and what we see before us in the communities, in the context, and in the country and the countries that we are experiencing these conflicts and problems.
Thank you so much, Jerry. You've raised some really thorny issues. Some would say that truth is contested. There is not one, truth, and some may come at the truth from different angles. You also have raised the question of justice, and I suppose others might say justice for who, just from what perspective? And I think one of the questions that have come up as we prepared for this conversation is whether or not this war can be justified. But I also wanted to come to what happens when there are contradictions within the church itself or the faith community. For instance, the Russian Orthodox Church, for instance, standing by Russia. Those are some of the things maybe that we can tease out and pick up as the conversation goes along. Right now, I'd like to invite Ray Hartley to come on and also just give us his opening remarks and perspective from the business community. Ray, welcome. Are you with us, Ray?
Yeah, I made the mistake of the muted mic. Somebody had to do it. Everybody can learn from that. I think that both personally, but also in society at large, it's the conflict really between values and interests. That's how I see it, particularly looking at the political playing field. So, you may approach an issue from the perspective of what are your values and what does that then tell you about how you should react to the situation. Or you can say, well, what are our interests and how do we react to the situation? And I think that if you look at the Ukrainian conflict, I think from a value point of view, personally, but also socially, in South Africa's case, our values are enshrined in our constitution. There is a general social belief in that constitution. And the constitution clearly states that sovereignty should be respected, that, we should be democratic societies, and so on. So from that point of view, it directs you quite strongly to say that an authoritarian society invading a democratic society is clearly wrong, and whether or not the circumstances surrounding it may be amplified doesn't really matter. You cannot accept that fundamental breach of sovereignty and of the values of democracy. From an interest point of view, and this is quite interesting because the interests aren't as clear, I think, as some would like to say they are. We do have an interest, for example, in having relationships across the global spectrum. We need commercial, industrial, trade relations with the West. We need them with China and to some extent with Russia, although we don't have much really commercial kind of relationship with Russia as such. But what's quite interesting, I think, is to try and unpack why the government's point of view has flip-flopped from the one to the other. Because it's quite interesting that the initial reaction was to condemn the invasion. Say invasion was wrong, Russia should not have invaded. There was a statement issued in public. By the time it came around to the United Nations General Assembly resolution, the position had changed. And South Africa was now not going to take a stand on this conflict and was going to be neutral, supposedly in order to maintain some kind of capacity to negotiate with both sides. And now, more recently, as the Russians have been beaten back in eastern and southern Ukraine, and it doesn't look very good for them on the battlefield, we've seen an interesting twist again back to the first position. So on Sunday, we had the spokesman for Turco saying, no, but we condemned it. Remember back in the statement we issued right at the beginning, one which they've not referred to and have tried to bury ever since, is now back. And they're saying we did condemn it. So I think there's a conflict in the South African government about how to approach this. I think there are some who think it should be approached from the, value-based kind of, we're a democratic country, this is a sovereignty issue. And there are others who think that it should be approached from an interest, and there's a vacillation between those 2 points of view. So that would be my analysis.
Thank you so much, Ray, for that. I guess my follow-up question would be, to what extent, even in the business community, business leadership itself, to what extent is that vacillation between values and interests? Should South African businesses or other businesses globally be considering not doing business with Russia or Russian companies, etc.? What should companies and businesses be taking a moral line here as well, a value-based line in how it is that they approach their decisions? Or should it be more interest-based? And I think this also goes particularly for those businesses that, like you said, that have an interest in maintaining relations globally. And I think the other important point is this contradiction within the South African government. And I'm wondering to what extent South Africa's, the ANC's own history with Russia is blurring the lines here in terms of the position that the South African government is taking. And with that said, I want to bring in Stephen Gruzd to just take us through from an academic, I guess, and a research perspective, a civil society perspective on this as well, as to how we are to read into this conflict and how the South African government is positioning itself here. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Nompumelelo, and good morning to everybody. This is a very interesting conflict. I think many thought that by the time we get to 2022, violence will be a thing of the past. We'll be able to negotiate away anything. And of course, weapons have become much more sophisticated, and it's become a very brutal war. You talked about whether war can be just, and there's been a lot of discussion of this for hundreds of years. Ever since there have been wars, people have tried to regulate them and make rules as to when one should go to war, what one should do in war, and what one should do after a war. And this one is no exception. But I think there's a distinction between what is a just war and what is a justified war. You can justify anything. And indeed, the Russians, Putin has said there are Nazis in power in Ukraine. This is a continuation of us fighting the Nazis in the 1930s and 1940s. We want to get rid of those elements. Russian speakers are being discriminated against in the east of Ukraine, and they want us there. So, and then, of course, there's NATO wanting to encroach on Russia's borders and expand, and the European Union also wanting to expand, and basically Ukraine wanting to leave the orbit of Russia. So those were reasons given for the conflict by the Russians, who haven't called it a war. They've called it a special military operation. And, so it's easy to justify. And I think the other thing we've seen in this war is that it's happening as much in the media and in cyberspace and in social media as it is on the battlefield. I'm not trying to diminish what's happening on the ground, but it's also a war that's very much being fought on the airwaves and through social media. And if you look at the contrast in the way that the two leaders are presenting themselves, Putin is very buttoned up in a suit. Often when he's meeting foreign delegates, they are seated at a huge table, tens of meters away from him. He's very formal, he's very stiff. Zelensky, on the other hand, has been wearing military fatigues or T-shirts. He often will leave the podium of a press conference and actually come and sit down on the level of the audience. He's made many clips and many inspirational speeches, and he's just come across to me anyway as more personable, more serious, more likable, and that you would believe what he says. So I think language is also a very important element of this war. And I think Russia for a long time has been putting out disinformation into the world and is making everything relative. So, for example, also to remember that this invasion didn't start in 2022. Russia has been occupying eastern Ukraine since 2014. And you'll remember the Malaysian aircraft that was shot out of the sky by the Russians. They wanted to blame the Ukrainians. They blamed everybody else. They put a very deliberate attack on truth that Jerry was talking about, saying that, you have your version and we have our version, and there isn't an objective truth. And I think that's one of the elements that is at play here. And I think, South Africa has also had its justifications for why it is taking the position that it is taking. The statement that came out on the 24th of February that Russia must withdraw its troops indeed was preceded by one which said all sides need to refrain from war and we need to negotiate on this. And so there was a change there. And then we saw President Ramaphosa being much more publicly saying this is a war that NATO brought upon itself. And South Africa has then said it's pursuing a policy of strategic non-alignment or active non-alignment, harking back to Cold War days, saying we're neutral. But then, for example, the Minister of Defense goes to a military conference that's being held by the Russian Ministry of Defense in Moscow. So do you go to a belligerent in a war if you are truly neutral? I think that's wearing a little bit thin. And people are saying, well, if we say we're neutral, but we seem to be leaning towards the Russians. The last example I'll mention is when the UN was talking about a establishing humanitarian corridors in March, April in Ukraine. South Africa proposed an alternative resolution to the one that France and Mexico had proposed. And we didn't even mention Russia at all in that resolution. And many said was very much the Russian line. So, yeah, we can talk about how South Africa's position has formed and what it wants to do. But I think I'll stop there with my opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you have clearly painted the picture that South Africa is a conflicted party here. And yet historically, South Africa has positioned itself as, a negotiator of peace and, bringing resolution to conflict situations, even here on the continent. And I guess this conflict between Russia and Ukraine is really bringing, casting the spotlight back on on South Africa in terms of its ability right now to cast itself as an ethical, leader in the face of not just conflict on the continent, but across the globe, and even in how the South African government handles conflict within the country. And I want to go back then to you, Jerry, in terms of the role of the faith community. I had raised earlier a question about what then happens when there is no agreement within the church itself about how to approach a situation like the Russian conflict. Where else then can we look to for leadership if we are seeing these inconsistencies within governments and in our own government, and then we are also seeing these contradictions within the faith community? So maybe just take us through that. Are we understanding this correctly? How is it that the Council of Churches is approaching this issue?
I think before you spoke about the issues of justice and truth and how do we define that? And I think that's absolutely true, because that suddenly becomes relative terms and subjective to one's experience. And people in situations where they actually feel that they are right, they define justice according to them, and they come to truth according to their perspective. But I think in terms of the religious faith, and if I speak more specifically as a Christian, we should not necessarily struggle with that. Because when we understand the scriptures quite clearly, the Bible tells us that God stands with the poor, the oppressed, the neglected, the abused. And if we have to understand that, then the point is that the churches, religious communities, need to be standing with the suffering masses. So when you look at the issue of the Ukraine-Russian war, when you look at these situations in South Africa, for example, that's where religious communities need to be. They need to be asking, how do we stand to champion the cause of the suffering masses? And that's the big issue. But the problem is this. The problem is that churches themselves take positions that are not often purely related to scriptural understandings. It is confounded by political anecdotes. It is confounded by economic situations and analyses. It is confounded by realities that actually puts them in situations of whether we are under threat ourselves or whether we are comfortable to say what we're saying. So, for example, getting to the situation in the Ukraine-Russian context, the Orthodox Church in Russia, this is where we, as the WCC, were having a big conversation about whether some people call for the suspension of the Russian Orthodox Church. And we had to ask the question, do we suspend them or not? And the decision of the WCC was to actually keep them in a relationship with us in dialogue. The reason being is that if they were not with us, then we lost them. But we need to have them with us so that we can consistently have a dialogue and negotiate these differences that we may have in terms of what we understand. But given the context of this Russian Orthodox Church in Russia, given the context of the Russian government and how it pressurizes people, including the church, one needs to understand that the church cannot speak in its own pure voice. And therefore, it is also expected, in order to save itself, it must also speak the voice of its particular government. And unfortunately, that may be true in this context. And so one has to understand the dynamics of that. So we keep continuing to have this dialogue with the Russian Orthodox Church, and yet in the same breath, we keep trying to establish with them, what does the scripture say about this? How do we actually justify war when we should not be doing that? How do we stand in favor of a government's policy when we know that those policies are conflictive and it does not even describe what we should be believing and doing as religious bodies? So it's not so easy, it is complex. So this is why you have this differentiation between churches and the different positions that they take. It is often not, I argue for the purity of scripture to be led in terms of where God stands, as God stands with the poor and oppressed, as I've said. And if the churches and religious bodies can come to that narrative, I think we will take different positions on a lot of issues. And more particularly, I think we will be able to stand together and say together strongly, this is what we believe, this is the injustice that we see, this is the truth that we're speaking about, and this is what we must do. Unfortunately, it's not so easy. We are also people living in a real context. We are also people mixed up with the different feelings and views of different sectors and groups of people. And that, unfortunately, speaks to our eventual decisions on what we do. And therefore, religious bodies live in contradiction as well and have inconsistencies about what they should be saying. But my point here is that I think if we read the scriptures correctly, we should know what we should be doing. Unfortunately, it is not as clear as that.
It's a very interesting submission that you're making, and I want to relate it back to perhaps the conflict within the South African government as well, because isn't the point that they are also keeping Russia in this dialogue, in this relationship of dialogue, and not trying not to push them away, so that they have Russia's ear in this, so that they can show them also what the right thing to do is. And I want to bring you back in, Stephen. Based on what the World Council of Churches is doing with the Russian Orthodox Church, can we relate it to what perhaps the South African government is trying to do as well in the context of its relationship with Russia, keeping Russia close?
Yes, I think South Africa, towards the beginning of this conflict, had pretensions of being a mediator, of actually being someone that could bring both sides together and get some sort of peace talks on the go. And we know that President Ramaphosa spoke to President Putin quite early on in the war. But, mediation 101 also means that you need to talk to the other side. And it took him, I think, 6 or 7 weeks to then speak to President Zelensky. In the interim, the Ukrainian ambassador in South Africa sought an audience with President Ramaphosa, sought an audience with Minister Pandor, and was rejected and rebuffed, and said that an ambassador doesn't talk to a president, and so all sorts of excuses were made. So I don't think South Africa was really serious about that mediation. I don't think it had the diplomatic muscle or the standing that we had. And I think once it made its positions clear in the abstentions at the UN, certainly the trust of Ukraine was dissipated. I think there have been many that have been disappointed by South Africa's stance, but perhaps not surprised. I know the European embassies and governments were very upset with South Africa's position, and were trying to put pressure on it to condemn the war more unequivocally. But that didn't happen. So I think it is important. It's always important to have open lines of dialogue, and perhaps South Africa is better placed than we think they are. I mean, we have a long history of friendship with the Soviet Union, which supported the liberation movements, and I think there's some romanticism about that the Russia today really is the Soviet Union of 1986, which I think clearly isn't the case. Just two points to say. One, some have said and condemned the removal of the RT channel Russia Today, formerly Russia Today, from the DSTV bouquet, saying, well, it's a shame because we can't see what the Russian government, how they are seeing that conflict, and that it shouldn't have been taken off the air. This was a decision that was made in Europe and not in South Africa because of the sanctions. And also to say, sometimes churches or religious organizations are co-opted and to support government policies. And I think we don't have to look very far at the history of the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa, which was very happy in the beginning to justify apartheid based on scripture and based on its reading of the Bible and based on power realities. I think I really agree with Jerry that it's not in a vacuum. It's not in a utopia. It happens in the real world of interests and politics. So I think while the attempts of South Africa to mediate were not very robust, and I don't think were taken very seriously, we may have a role further down the line as this conflict becomes more ripe for resolution.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And I want to just link it back then to Ray's point around interests and values. And I think it's also not very difficult to see in the South African context as well that we have really been moving away from values-based a values-based approach, not just in leadership, but in day-to-day life and how it is that we approach things. It's really driven by personal interest, by a desire to, get what we personally want to get. And I want to bring up the example, for instance, of state capture and the role of business in state capture as well, you know, in our country, and the fact that business itself seems very happy to follow the line of being interest-driven rather than values-driven. And I had asked a follow-up question after your submission, Ray, about how business itself is approaching its own decision-making about trade and commerce in the context of this conflict, and to the extent to which this is impacted, you know, by the values interests discussion. Ray, can you come on that?
Yeah, I think in this particular case, I think as far as business goes, values and interests are pretty much aligned, because the economic effect of this invasion has been pretty catastrophic. It's pushed up inflation, it's pushed up fuel prices, it's made life a lot harder for business and for ordinary people in South Africa. So there's no question that they would like to see that conflict ended, and that they would be against. I'm generalizing because I think business is not homogenous, but in general they would be totally against this sort of disruption of key logistical resource markets. So, and then from a values point of view, they would probably be more aligned with an open democratic society like Ukraine than a closed authoritarian society like Russia. But business, I think, is I mean, I don't speak on behalf of business, let me just be clear before someone from business takes issue with me, but I think that they've kind of stayed on the sidelines, really, of this issue. And there are sort of aspects of the business relationship that are questionable. You know, the fact that one of the Russian oligarchs is a major donor to the ruling party has been raised as an issue because it might explain the sort of flip-flopping on the ANC's part when it comes to this conflict. So, yeah, I wanted to come back to an issue you raised, which is quite interesting, the struggle history issue, and the nostalgia, you know, issue, which I think is a bit of really just a red herring. I mean, you know, the first group of ANC exiles that went for training in Odessa in Ukraine, and the second group went for training in the Crimea, which was part of Ukraine. And then there were some who went for training later in parts of Russia. But there's actually quite a strong affinity between the ANC and Ukraine, actually. And, so and that Soviet Union no longer exists. Ukraine is its own country now. So in other words, choosing the part of your nostalgia that fits with your political thing is not really a very convincing way to go about things. So we had this relationship with the Soviet Union, which is no longer there, and we now sort of ignore the fact that the parts of it that we had a relationship with are inconveniently in Ukraine, and emphasize the other parts. It's just kind of really a red herring, I think. I just wanted to raise a different issue as well when it comes to interests, because it's not only a sort of NATO and Russia/China issue. There's also the Africa issue, and I think that we're in quite big danger of being misaligned in Africa. So if you look at the sort of, the four-pointed star of Kenya, Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa, 3 of those countries condemned that invasion. Kenya, Egypt, and Nigeria, and South Africa didn't. And then in the SADC itself, Zambia, Malawi, Lesotho even, Botswana, all voted to condemn this invasion. So we might be a little bit misaligned in Africa, actually, because we're now sitting with a bunch of countries that don't really have a very good track record when it comes to values, that were on the abstaining side.
Thank you, Ray. You've made a really important point there about the African context. But I want us to go now, let's go down to the nitty-gritty. This conflict has real victims. We have the Russians that have invaded an actual country, destroyed civilian infrastructure, have displaced many people. People have lost their lives, have lost their livelihoods. They've lost access to healthcare. They've lost access to education. Children have lost parents. They've been orphaned. This is the real experience of Ukrainians on the ground. These are the real victims. And we can talk about the truth being relative. We can talk about, justice, but they are actual people who are suffering. And Jerry mentioned the importance of standing with the poor, of standing with the abused, of standing with the victims. And I think it's something that is very important to highlight and to foreground, that this is not just it's not a theoretical conversation that we're having. And I think as we give our inputs on this matter, of particularly where we as South Africans stand on this, where our government stands on this, and the response to this. How do we stand in solidarity with the victims of this war? Having highlighted the complexity of this issue, what should the actions be that we take? Others may also argue that there are victims on the Russian side as well, victims of disinformation, from their own government, etc. How do we offer solidarity to the victims of this conflict, and at the same time still maintain this idea that we're standing for truth, even if some of the victims might be Russian, for instance? I think let me throw that one at Jerry first.
Thank you. I think that's an important question. I mean, if I could just talk about the World Council of Churches for a moment. When we had our assembly just this past 2 weeks actually, one of the things that we did was to bring the Ukrainians to the assembly. There were also participants from the Russian Orthodox Church, because they're all part of the council, so we had to bring everybody in for the conversation. And we had to speak with the Ukrainians to ask, what do we do to assist you? How can we be of support to you? And I think that's the crucial thing, is that we need to ask, how can we stand with you in terms of your situation? And our focus too, as the Council of Churches, was not on the politics of the situation, but on the people who are suffering. How do we stand with your people who are suffering in this particular situation? And they were able to give us some ideas in terms of how we can work with churches and through churches and religious bodies and organizations. And we're able to do that. So I think that's a critical thing, is to ask the people concerned, how can we actually stand with you? What can we do to actually be supportive in the situation? But I think one of the things that they've been asking for us to do consistently is to actually create the awareness and make this an international problem, and let the world look at the situation and be able to speak into the context of what is happening. So I think that's one of the crucial things. I just want to get a little bit more political for a moment in terms of our South African context. We need to ask, for example, in terms of South Africa's views, the government's views on this whole situation at first. How does the BRICS relationship, when you're talking about values and interest, how does the BRICS relationship actually guide our interest as versus against our values in what we believe? Because we have been a country that has been saying we honor values, but yet when we come, and if you notice, the countries that actually stood against refusing to be critical of Russia really have been part of the BRICS partnerships. And we need to ask these questions because that's critical. So I think we, in terms of South Africa and in terms of religious bodies, need to ask, how do we journey with people? What can we do? Of course, as you mentioned, There are situations where hospitals and schools and people's livelihood has been affected. We need to ask, what can we do to partner in terms of getting assistance into the Ukraine, for example, to assist people on the ground? Because unfortunately, in a war situation and even with sanctions, let's be honest, the suffering people suffer the most. And the people who actually get more hard hit are the people who are already down in the pits. And so we need to ask, how do we actually journey with those people in particular to enable them to be able to withstand the impact of the suffering that they're currently facing? So I think we as churches are asking the question, and we are trying to journey with the people, because the people in the situation are the people best to advise us on what assistance we can provide for them. But we really need to side with them. We really need to say, what are the things that you want us to get involved with? The politics is the politics, but we as religious bodies need to get involved in the sufferings of the people, which I've been repeatedly saying, because I believe that's where religious bodies need to stand, irrespective of whether on which side of the conflict and who is responsible and who's not responsible. But the fact of the matter is, and I must say this quite emphatically, war cannot be justified in this context of Ukraine and Russia. It is totally unnecessary and uncalled for. The devastation that we are seeing is really, really unacceptable. And we need to ask the question, how do we get them to a dialogue? How do we actually come to end this war? Because this is where I think religious bodies must come and play a role, is to find out what can we do to actually end this war. So one of the things that I'm doing quite consistently now in my new role as the WCC General Secretary-elect is to say, how can religious bodies, religious people and leaders come together and work with the scriptures that they use in terms of faith expressions and faith beliefs, and find through their particular experiences solutions to these complex problems, not getting the baggage of political affiliations and contextual experiences in terms of the different perspectives, but to ask, how can we as religious people be helpful in a situation of conflict? And I think that's what ethical leadership is all about. I think we need to ask that question more consistently. We need to ask the question more in terms of where it should be asked, in line with people suffering. And then we need to ask the question, as you open the scriptures, what does God say to you about war? What does God say to you about violence? And we then need to take a position that actually brings peace. And peace is really what we need to be working towards.
Yeah, thank you. Let me bring you in, Stephen. I mean, this is, in as much as it's a political issue, it is a humanitarian crisis. And how are we seeing the policy, approaches to that as well, or the responses to that, not only just from the South African government perspective, but generally, what is happening on that front?
I think the countries around Ukraine have been incredibly accommodating of refugees. I mean, millions, literally millions of people have had to flee the country and have gone into neighboring countries. And on the whole, I think they've really been welcomed, which has then, given rise to questions of, okay, these are mostly white women and children that are coming into these countries, yet Europe is so hostile to African immigrants, and people are dying in the Mediterranean on a daily basis trying to cross from Libya and other places. So, do wars where more white populations are involved, are they more important? Is this a war that is really universal, or is it a Europe's war? Why should it matter to South Africa? I mean, I think there's always two sides to a war, and usually somebody starts it. And I agree with Jerry that I don't think there's justification for Russia's invasion of a sovereign neighbor, whatever the history and whatever the purported causes are. But Ukraine has also shown the right to resist aggression, the right to fight back, the right to try and recapture this territory and try and force an end to this war. So, there's always two parties, otherwise, it wouldn't be called a war. And it's as the speakers have said, it's complex. Just to go to pick up Jerry's points about the BRICS, I think There is an interesting dynamic there. Of course, South Africa is probably the most enthusiastic of the BRICS members and has probably been since it was admitted. It likes playing in the big league with powerful countries. And we've seen mostly a neutral stance taken by the BRICS countries. Certainly, China has refused to condemn Russia. India has refused to condemn Russia. Brazil had a schizophrenic reaction, a little bit like South Africa, where the foreign ministry condemned, but the president condoned. And so there's some tensions in there. But I think what appeals to South Africa and Russia makes a play of this, being an anti-imperialist country, being against colonialism, being against unipolarity in the world where America is the undisputed leader, that there should be multiple poles of power, that there should be, that the world should look different to the way that it does. And I think that appeal to wanting to change the rules of the international system, to make them more democratic, to give more power and voice to the developing world really resonates with South Africa's government. And I think they see, rightly or wrongly, kindred spirits. I saw in the chat there was the question of, well, surely not everything is relative. Surely there is truth and right and wrong, and I believe there is. But I think Russia's tactic is to put truth in doubt, is to say there's always a version, to say what you see on CNN is not the truth. It is the truth from one person's point of view, and we have our own point of view. And I think they are very sophisticated in this messaging and in this methodology to undermine objective truth. I mean, it just reminds me of when Donald Trump got elected and he had his inauguration party, and they took a photograph of the mall and in Washington, around the Washington Monument and the Capitol, and compared that picture to Obama's inauguration. And it was clear to anybody seeing those pictures side by side that there were less people at Trump's inauguration. And one of his aides said, well, we have alternative facts. And when you can have alternative facts, that's a worrying situation. So I think Russia deliberately tries to sow confusion, to undermine, to conduct malign activities, and if when we could watch Russia Today on our TV screens, you saw a completely different situation. And I think the Russian people are given a completely different narrative to what we outside of Russia are seeing.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephen. I want to just touch on some of the comments from the audience. There's one here from Mafules Matlane, who is agreeing with Reverend Pillay, saying that why are we being so inconsistent? It's a critical question. And he says if we answer that question, we'll get to the root of the problem. And then we've got one from Henry, who says, good morning from Berlin, Prof. Pillay. Have you actually had a conversation with your colleagues from the Russian church after the invasion? What was your impression? It seems to me that they condone all actions of Putin. And I think, Jerry, you've given us some perspective on that. Then there's one from Horst Miller. He says, I am part of the South African Council of Churches, and we have been awfully quiet about the Ukrainian situation, whilst continue to be outspoken on Israel and Palestine. Our reaction to Operation Dudula was to form a study group to give a theological perspective, but there was no outright condemnation on dehumanizing the stranger in our midst. What must be done so that we start speaking up again? What could be, another question, what could be considered a just cause for war or military intervention? I think that's a little bit beyond the scope of our conversation today, but it has been touched on. I think Stephen has touched on it, Jerry has touched on it. And then not forgetting the more than 50,000 Russian soldiers killed, also victims of their own leaders. And then another question, does a country with a weak military inadvertently become less aggressive and more diplomatic? I think this is an interesting question to consider. I want us to wrap the conversation, and I want you all to give your closing remarks as you respond to some of the comments if you want to respond to them. But can we just wrap up and say, what are we concluding here? We've actually really, I think one of the things we've done well is to show how complex this issue is. And I think another thing we've also done well is to show that there is a need for continuing and continuous dialogue and questioning of positions taken and of actions from all involved, particularly our government. And then the third thing that I think we've underscored is the importance of supporting the victims of conflict. And I want to start with you, Ray, as we wrap up the conversation, what your final thoughts are.
Yeah, I think, I mean, just one sort of slightly off those topics. I do think there's an opportunity for South Africa to pull it out of the fire, which has begun to sort of take shape with Durko saying that they're re-emphasizing their original condemnation, and the fact that Ramaphosa will be in Washington September the 16th with Biden, and potentially could actually open some channels between Washington and Moscow and act as some sort. I mean, this is his skill set, you know. This is what he does, and what makes him sometimes ineffective as a president is to be able to try and bring together two contradictory points of view so that they find each other somewhere. So there is that opportunity that we should, I think, hope for, that we will still pull it out of the fire and not go down in history as that country that went to the defense summit in Moscow during the Ukraine war. I think on the Russian soldiers, I do think there are victims there. A lot of them are not from the industrial and larger cities in Russia. They're from the poor rural areas and have signed up out of desperation. They sign something called a contract. They get a certain amount of rubles, probably the only income they're going to get. And then they're given a few weeks training in some cases and find themselves, you know, facing a highly sophisticated military, and they get annihilated. And this is not good. I don't think it's you know, one shouldn't hate them in the way that some people do, because I think that's not the right approach. One should feel sympathy really for these young Russians that end up in the sort of meat grinder in Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Ray. Stephen?
Thank you. Yes, agreeing with Ray. I think for centuries, Russia has thrown young men to their deaths from Tsarist days through to Stalin, and today in this war. I think it's the poor. It's the poor that fight and the poor that are involved. I'd like to just pick up on the last question. Is misinformation and propaganda the new weapon of mass destruction? Well, it's certainly a weapon, and it certainly plays a very important role, and we need to be alert to misinformation, disinformation. We've got to verify what we receive on our social media and apply our judgment. But definitely, I think wars are already fought in cyberspace and will continue to be fought in cyberspace. They're never going to be purely fought on the battleground. And that's why it was so important for Minister Lavrov to come to African countries and shake hands with foreign ministers and presidents to say, look, we're not isolated, which then prompted other powers to do the same. So we've had visits from Germany, we've had visits from the USA to Africa, all trying to get the photo op and the optics of that. So yes, I think part of what our duty as civil society is to talk about these issues, to air them, to have conversations like this, and to hold our governments accountable if it's doing things that we don't believe are correct.
Thank you, Stephen. And Jerry, you have the last word.
I think South Africa has a very important role to play in terms of peacemaker and trying to offer some solutions to the world's problems. Given our own history and what we've been through and what we've learned in the process, certainly shapes us from that perspective. Unfortunately, we too have lost our path, and our path has been lost primarily because we allowed those interests or the different interests to actually shape our movement forward. And we need to relook at that. If our focus is on the people, the suffering masses, and if our focus is on actually working towards that end, I think we will stay in line. Now, it's important to realize that whilst we are in dialogue and trying to provide a neutral space for people to participate, and South Africa is taking that position admittedly, which is a good position. But being in dialogue does not mean you cannot afford to be critical. When there is a need to condemn something like war in that sense, then one needs to be critical of that. So one does not, the sense of silence diplomacy sometimes doesn't work. You need to say, yes, we can be in dialogue, we can actually exercise certain levels of diplomacy, but how do we do this even in the sense of being critical? And therefore, that space must be open to us. We've learned from our past, we are learning in our present. We need to be able to shape the future with honesty, with truth, and with standing up for justice and standing up for that which is important for us to create a better world for all. And I trust and hope that we will see it that way.
Thank you so much to our able panel. I want to invite Chris from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation just to give us a wrap of the dialogue this morning. Chris, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. I think a phenomenal conversation. Thank you so much to our panel and also to the excellent MC, Nompumelelo. You've done a great job steering us through choppy waters. From our perspective as a Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, I think I'd like to stress the importance of multilateralism. And as a associated term as well, the importance of pluralism when dealing with complex problems. Whenever information is centralized, whenever things are made simple, whenever somebody says they have the solution, the whole answer, or when they say, what about? I think our ears need to prick up and we need to say, it might be more complicated than that. I welcome especially that South Africans have been going to Ukraine, like John Steenhuisen, like Greg Mills of the Brenthurst Foundation, in order to get more integrity, in order to get more of our perspectives on the ground, and to ensure that the world recognizes that we are not just the ANC and not just the government, that we are a population with many diverse views, and that we are seeking to understand what's going on. Similarly, I think Jerry Pillay mentioned a very important thing, which is to keep the victim at the front of mind. And it doesn't matter when you're speaking about the Iraq war, when you're speaking about the Israeli conflict, when you're speaking about the conflict in the DRC or in Ethiopia. The question we should ask ourselves is, where is the suffering and how can we alleviate some of the suffering? So thank you very much. I think an excellent conversation. I hand the floor back to you, Nompumelelo, to send us on our way into this Wednesday.
Wednesday. Thank you so much, Chris. And I just want to invite our audience to keep in touch with the Business Day on all its platforms so that you can hear about the next conversations happening, the one on hunger and the other one on a just energy transition, which is a Business Day Dialogues in association with Konrad Adenauer Foundation and the Ecumenical Foundation of Southern Africa. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, and please join us again in the next upcoming dialogues. For now, goodbye and have a good Wednesday further.